A black father, exhausted from back-to-back meetings, was finally heading home to his twin daughters. But the moment he stepped into the airport, everything changed. A gate agent, armed with nothing but bias and authority, decided he didn't belong in first class even though his ticket said otherwise. In front of a crowd of passengers, he was questioned, humiliated, and told he must have made a mistake. 7 minutes later, the airline realized their mistake, but by then, it was too late. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire industry and sparked a movement no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into it. It all started with a seat assignment. The airport hummed with the kind of orchestrated chaos that only seasoned travelers knew how to navigate. The rhythmic roll of luggage wheels against polished tile, the distant crackle of boarding announcements, the occasional burst of laughter from families reunited. It was a symphony of movement. A testament to human ambition and the ever-present desire to go somewhere. Be somewhere. Become someone new. Maya and Mila Robinson, two 11-year-old twins, stood at the heart of it all. Their matching pink dresses like bright beacons in a sea of hurried professionals and weary tourists. Today was their day, their first flight without their parents, their first true taste of independence. They had memorized every instruction their father had given them: be polite, follow directions, and call when they landed. And so, with excitement fizzing beneath their skin, they clutched their boarding passes, standing on the precipice of an adventure. But adventure has a way of writing its own script. Addison Riley had seen it all. 17 years of working as a flight attendant had carved her into someone sharp and unyielding. Someone who believed in order, in protocol, in the unwavering rules of the sky. Airports, after all, were pressure cookers, full of people who believed their destination was more important than the next person's. She had no patience for entitlement, no tolerance for disruption, and in her experience, trouble often arrived in unexpected packages. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the pre-boarding bustle like the edge of a well-honed blade. She eyed the girls' suitcases with skepticism. "Those bags won't fit in the overhead compartment." Maya's fingers tightened around her boarding pass. "But our dad measured them. He made sure they were the right size." "Well, your dad isn't here, is he?" Addison's smile was tight, rehearsed. "And I'm telling you they're too big." The twins exchanged a glance. The kind of silent conversation only siblings understand. Maya hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But Mila had always been the one to push back, the one who refused to be dismissed. "We can try to fit them," she offered, her confidence unwavering. "And if they don't fit, we'll check them." But Addison had already made her decision. "That's not how this works," she said. "The decision has been made." Nearby, a line of first-class passengers, mostly white, mostly men in suits wrinkled from business meetings, rolled their own oversized luggage past security without so much as a second glance. The twins noticed. Addison pretended not to. In the end, they had no choice but to surrender their bags, watching as they disappeared down the conveyor belt, their carefully packed belongings slipping out of reach. And so, with only their small backpacks filled with snacks, a shared tablet, and their father's reassurances ringing in their ears, they stepped onto the plane. Unaware that the course of their day, their lives, had already shifted. The trouble didn't come all at once. Trouble never does. It crept in slowly, like a gathering storm. As the girls settled into their seats, they whispered about the games they planned to play on the tablet. Nothing louder than the hum of the aircraft. Nothing more disruptive than a page turning in a book. And yet, Addison's gaze lingered. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharper now. "Those seats are reserved." Mila frowned. "These are our seats," she said, holding up the boarding passes. 14A and 14B. Addison plucked the passes from her hand, scanning them with narrowed eyes before handing them back without apology. "Stay seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." "We know," Maya murmured. "Our dad flies all the time." Something about the comment a child correcting her made Addison's jaw tighten. "Well, good for your dad." Across the aisle, chaos reigned. A white family, 3 young children with sticky fingers and boundless energy, had turned their row into a playground. The youngest, a boy no older than 5, bounced on his seat, his mother barely managing to buckle him in. The other 2 darted up and down the aisle, their laughter ringing through the cabin. Addison approached them with a warm smile, crouching down to eye level with the smallest child. "Let's get you settled in, buddy," she cooed. "Flying is so exciting, isn't it?" The contrast was unmistakable. Maya and Mila sat in silence, their hands folded in their laps, their backs pressed against their seats, watching, learning. It wasn't until the flight was nearly full that the moment of no return arrived. Mila reached into her backpack for her water bottle. In the process, Maya's bag perched unsteadily on her lap slipped into the aisle. A small movement, a nothing moment, but Addison pounced. "I told you to remain seated," she snapped, storming toward them. "I'm sorry," Maya said quickly, reaching for the bag. "It was an accident." Addison's expression was stone. "This is your second disruption." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unearned. "We didn't do anything wrong," Mila said, her voice rising, confusion thickening into fear. "Do not argue with flight crew," Addison said, her voice carrying through the cabin. "It's a federal offense." The twins sat frozen. Around them, the plane had gone quiet. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others averted their eyes. One elderly woman nodded approvingly. The world had already made up its mind about them. "You're being removed from this flight," Addison announced. Maya's breath hitched. "Can we call our dad? Once you're back in the terminal." And just like that, they were escorted off. Two little girls in pink dresses stepping into a nightmare they hadn't asked for. They didn't know that a passenger had recorded everything. They didn't know that within the hour, their story would become a headline. They didn't know that at that very moment, their father was finalizing a deal that would make him the majority owner of the airline that had just humiliated his daughters. They only knew one thing. This wasn't about a bag. It never was. Marcus Robinson had built an empire on knowing when to act. Timing was everything in business. Hesitate too long, and an opportunity would slip through your fingers. Move too fast without all the facts, and you risked making mistakes that couldn't be undone. But as he stared at the video playing on his phone, his signature still wet on the contract that gave him controlling ownership of Skyward Airlines, he felt something he hadn't in years. A fury so sharp it was almost surgical. It wasn't the anger of a man who had just witnessed his daughters being humiliated and escorted off a plane. It was the clarity of a man who knew, with absolute certainty, that he was about to change everything. The video was spreading like wildfire, consuming social media in a way that only the most visceral, undeniable injustices ever did. The footage, shaky, recorded from a passenger's phone, captured every second in excruciating detail. The way Maya and Mila sat quietly, their pink dresses bright against the dull airplane seats. The way Addison Riley's voice cut through the cabin, sharp as broken glass. The way the twins hesitated before standing, looking at each other as if they were waiting for someone, anyone, to say something on their behalf. And the way the silence from the other passengers was louder than any of it. The video had been online for only 40 minutes, and already it had over 2 million views. Marcus barely had time to process that before his phone rang again. "Sir, it's Caroline Weber," the voice on the other end said. Rushed, urgent. "I assume you've seen." "I've seen." Marcus cut in, his tone even, controlled. "Where are my daughters?" "They're in our premium lounge with customer service representatives. They're safe. I want to speak to them." Of course. There was a pause, then the sound of a call being transferred. A beat later, Maya's voice, small but steady, filled his ear. "Daddy?" He could tell she was holding back tears. Not because she wasn't upset she was, but because she didn't want to make this harder than it already was. He closed his eyes, willing himself to push aside his rage for just a moment. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said. "Are you and Mila okay?" A hesitation. Then, "We didn't do anything wrong." It was that sentence, the quiet certainty of it, that sealed it for him. This wasn't just about making things right for his daughters. This was about making sure it never happened to anyone else. "Sit tight," he told them. "I'm on my way." At 36,000 feet, Captain Benjamin Hayes had flown through turbulence bad enough to make grown men pray. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the message he had just received from air traffic control. Flight 1423 was being diverted back to its departure airport by direct order of Skyward Airlines ownership. "Priority landing?" he confirmed through the radio. Certain he had misheard. "Confirmed, Captain," came the response. Details on the ground. Hayes exchanged glances with his co-pilot, who looked just as bewildered as he felt. In 3 decades of flying, he had never seen anything like this. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't weather. That meant it was something bigger. Something bad. Back in the cabin, Addison Riley was oblivious to the firestorm she had ignited. She moved through the aisles with the quiet authority she had cultivated over the years. Believing the crisis had already passed. She had done her job. Maintained order. Some of the passengers had even thanked her. As far as she was concerned, the matter was over. But then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes speaking. Due to circumstances beyond our control, we are being diverted back to our departure airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The shift in the cabin was immediate. People who had been settling in for the flight straightened in their seats. Murmurs rippled through the rows. Questions forming. Addison felt a flicker of unease, but dismissed it. Diversions happened all the time. She picked up the crew phone and dialed the cockpit. "Captain, is this mechanical?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "No," Hayes replied, his tone clipped. "It's coming from the top." For the first time, something twisted in Addison's stomach. On the ground, Caroline Weber was in full crisis mode. The video had gone viral at a speed even she hadn't anticipated. And now the airline was staring down the kind of PR nightmare that could sink a company. Worse, the internet had connected the dots. It wasn't just 2 little girls being removed from a flight. It was 2 little girls whose father now owned the airline. The hashtag Skyward Racism was trending nationally. A knock at her office door. Her assistant appeared, looking pale. "Mr. Robinson is here." Caroline stood as Marcus entered the room, his presence filling the space in a way that had nothing to do with his height or his tailored suit. "Mr. Robinson," she began, extending a hand. "First, let me. Where are my daughters?" He didn't take her hand. "They're safe," she said quickly. "They're in our premium lounge. Our customer care team is with them. Take me to them." As they walked through the terminal, Caroline scrambled to regain control of the conversation. "Sir, we're conducting a full investigation," she said. "The employee in question has been placed on administrative leave. We're..." "Miss Weber," Marcus cut in, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm not interested in your corporate damage control. I'm interested in accountability." In the lounge, Maya and Mila sat close together on stiff plastic seats, their matching pink dresses now wrinkled with stress. When they saw their father, they ran to him, composure finally shattering. "Daddy," Maya whispered against his chest. Marcus knelt, holding them tight, one arm around each daughter. "I'm here," he said. "You're safe now." Only once he was sure they were okay did he turn back to Caroline. "Now," he said, his voice like iron, "explain to me why my daughters were removed from that plane." Caroline swallowed. "We're still gathering all the facts." Marcus's expression didn't change. "The facts are on video. Miss Weber. Millions of people have seen them. I've seen them." Silence. "What I want to know," he continued, "is what you're going to do about it." By the time Flight 1423 taxied back to the gate, Addison Riley had begun to realize the ground beneath her was shifting. She didn't know why they had been diverted, but the murmurs among the passengers, the tension in the air, the phones raised and recording it all pointed to something much bigger than she understood. She was about to step off the plane when she saw the crowd waiting at the gate. Caroline Weber, Skyward executives, and standing beside them, unmistakable in his presence, was Marcus Robinson. Next to him, Maya and Mila. And then she knew. She had made a mistake. A mistake the whole world had seen. Addison Riley had always prided herself on control. She had learned early in her career that airports were pressure cookers. That order was the only thing standing between routine and chaos. But as she stepped off Flight 1423 and into the terminal, control was the one thing slipping through her fingers. The scene that awaited her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Executives with tight expressions, passengers whispering with phones still recording. And at the center of it all, a man whose mere presence shifted the gravity in the room. Marcus Robinson stood with his daughters beside him, his suit still crisp despite the storm brewing around him. His expression unreadable, but his eyes told her exactly what she needed to know. She had made a mistake. And not just any mistake, the kind that people don't forget. The kind that unravels careers. That forces entire industries to look at themselves in the mirror. The kind that no corporate script or rehearsed apology could erase. "Miss Riley." Caroline Weber's voice cut through the charged silence, forcing Addison to tear her gaze away from the man she now understood was not just another upset father, but the owner of the very airline she worked for. "This is Marcus Robinson, majority owner of Skyward Airlines, and father of Maya and Mila Robinson." The words landed like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. There was no need for embellishment. The truth was enough. Addison opened her mouth, reaching for anything to steady herself. "Sir, I was following protocol." Marcus tilted his head slightly, the kind of measured movement that told her he was giving her a chance. "But only one. Were you?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Or were you following a different protocol entirely? One that made you see two well-behaved black children as disruptive while ignoring actual disruptive behavior from white passengers?" A denial formed in her throat. Instinctual, automatic, but for the first time in her career. She hesitated before saying it. She could still hear the echoes of her own voice from earlier that day. "Do not argue with flight crew. It's a federal offense." She had said it with such certainty, such authority, never once considering that she might be the one in the wrong. She started, but Marcus wasn't finished. "My daughters were publicly humiliated. They were made to feel like criminals for nothing more than sitting in their assigned seats. And I watched you enforce rules selectively. I watched you decide, in an instant, who deserved patience and who deserved punishment." His voice didn't rise, but the weight of it pressed into the air between them, undeniable and unrelenting. "So tell me, Miss Riley, what exactly were you following?" The terminal had gone silent. The kind of silence that stretches, waiting for something to break it. Addison felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders. Heavier than her uniform, heavier than the years of certainty she had carried about who she was and how she did her job. Caroline cleared her throat, stepping in as though trying to pull the moment back into a place of corporate damage control. "Mr. Robinson, I understand how upsetting this is." "No," Marcus cut in, his voice still dangerously even. "You don't." Caroline blinked. "You don't understand because this is not the first time this has happened." Marcus continued, "Not just to my daughters, but to children, to families, to passengers who don't fit a certain mold of what is considered acceptable in first class, in business class, in an airline lounge. You don't understand because every time this happens, it's written off as a misunderstanding, as an isolated incident, as one employee making a bad call." He let the words hang in the air, then delivered the final blow. "But it is not an incident. It is a pattern. It was a statement of fact. And everyone in the room knew it. We will, of course, conduct a full investigation." Caroline tried again. But Marcus didn't even look at her this time. His focus remained on Addison. "My daughters deserve an apology," he said, "not a corporate statement, a real one, from you." The demand landed like a stone in Addison's chest. 17 years in this job. And she had never once apologized to a passenger. Never. Not even when she had to bump someone from a flight. Not even when she had made a call that later turned out to be incorrect. Because an apology, she had always believed, was an admission of wrongdoing. A crack in the armor of authority that she had spent her entire career fortifying. She swallowed. Her gaze flicked to Maya and Mila, still standing close to their father. Their pink dresses now wrinkled from stress but their eyes steady. Watching. Expecting. Addison had spent her career commanding respect. But what did respect look like now? Did it look like standing her ground? Like defending her choices? Like insisting that she had only been doing her job? Or did it look like something else entirely? She inhaled, the words sticking to her throat like wet paper. "I'm sorry," she said, barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression didn't change. Louder. Addison closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them, forcing herself to look at the girls directly. "I'm sorry for removing you from the flight," she said, her voice stronger this time. Clearer. "It was wrong." Maya and Mila studied her for a long moment, their expressions unreadable. Then, finally, they nodded small, solemn nods that carried more grace than Addison felt she deserved. Marcus let the silence settle, as if measuring the sincerity of the moment. Then he turned to Caroline. "I expect to see you and the entire executive team in the boardroom at 8 a.m. tomorrow," he said. "We have significant changes to discuss." And with that, he placed a protective hand on each of his daughter's shoulders and walked away, leaving behind a terminal full of whispers. a company on the brink of transformation, and a flight attendant who, for the first time in 17 years, had no idea where she stood. The boardroom at Skyward Airlines headquarters was designed to command respect. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, the morning sun glinting off glass and steel as if the city itself were watching what was about to unfold. The long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished to perfection, its surface reflecting the tension hanging in the air like an approaching storm. Executives sat stiffly in their leather chairs, shifting uncomfortably, their expensive suits suddenly feeling like armor that wasn't thick enough. At the head of the table stood Marcus Robinson. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. Authority lived in the spaces between his words, in the deliberate way he moved, in the way he let silence stretch just long enough to make people lean forward. And right now, the weight of that silence was pressing down on everyone in the room. Yesterday, he said, his voice even, measured, my daughters were removed from a Skyward flight for being black in pink dresses. A flicker of protest rippled through the room, but Marcus held up a hand. He wasn't finished. I know what some of you are thinking. That's an oversimplification. That this was an isolated incident. That there was a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, a regrettable but ultimately minor mistake. He let the words hang, then leaned forward slightly. That is exactly the kind of thinking that got us here. The room was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of traffic below. Marcus reached for the remote on the table and pressed a button. The massive screen at the end of the room flickered to life, playing the viral video that had now been viewed over 20 million times. It was an uncomfortable thing to watch, even for those who had already seen it. The way Maya and Mila sat quietly, their faces open and expectant. The way Addison Riley's voice, clipped and sharp, sliced through the cabin. The way the twins hesitated, their eyes scanning the faces around them, waiting for anyone to step in. And the way the silence of the other passengers was louder than all of it. I have the proof, Marcus said, as the video played on loop. What I don't have is an explanation. No one spoke. Finally, an older executive at the far end of the table cleared his throat. Mr. Robinson, he said, choosing his words carefully, this is a serious allegation. But we have procedures in place. If a flight attendant determined that passengers were disruptive, Marcus didn't even let him finish. What I saw in that video wasn't disruption. He said, what I saw was 2 children being targeted. And what I see in these reports, he gestured to a thick folder in front of him, is that this isn't just about my daughters. It's about a pattern. He flipped open the folder. Skyward's flight crews are 89% white. He let the number settle before turning the page. Customer complaints filed by passengers of color are 63% more likely to be dismissed without action. Another pause. And in the last 3 years, we have received multiple reports of racial bias in flight crew decisions, all of which were categorized as misunderstandings and quietly closed. He closed the folder. That stops today. A different executive, a woman in a gray blazer with a nervous but determined look in her eyes, finally spoke up. Sir, we've already initiated sensitivity training programs and diversity workshops. Marcus held up a hand. Miss Weber, I appreciate your quick response. But workshops and training programs are band-aids. We need surgery. The room shifted. This wasn't going to be one of those meetings where corporate buzzwords and polished press statements could smooth things over. Starting today, Marcus continued, there will be structural changes at every level of this company. Hiring practices, promotion pathways, customer service training, disciplinary processes, every single touch point that affects how passengers are treated. And that includes flight crews. His gaze swept the room. Because I will not own an airline that treats people the way my daughters were treated. Caroline Weber, head of customer relations, straightened in her seat. Sir, we understand the urgency, but restructuring at this level will take time. I have time, Marcus said, but what I don't have is patience for excuses. The silence that followed was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of people realizing that the world they operated in had just changed. And there was no going back. And then, to everyone's surprise, Addison Riley spoke. I want to be part of the solution. All eyes turned to her. She had been sitting near the end of the table, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly in front of her, looking like a woman who had spent the last 24 hours staring down every mistake she had ever made. Marcus studied her, And how do you propose to do that? She swallowed but didn't look away. I was wrong, she said, not just in what I did to Maya and Mila, but in how I've been doing my job for years. I didn't think I was biased. I thought I was just enforcing the rules. But that's the problem, isn't it? The rules don't always apply the same way to everyone. There was a pause. Then she exhaled sharply, like someone stepping off a ledge. I don't want to just keep my job. I want to change it. I want to help build a system that makes sure this doesn't happen again. Not just at Skyward, but anywhere. The room held its breath. Marcus considered her. He had spent years negotiating with people who said all the right things but meant none of them. Addison was many things, but she wasn't a liar. You have work to do, he said finally. A lot of it. She nodded. I know. Marcus glanced at Caroline. Put her on the team leading the restructuring. Let her be part of the process. Let her understand the depth of the problem. Caroline hesitated, then nodded. Marcus turned back to the rest of the executives. This isn't just about fixing a PR disaster. This is about proving that an airline can be more than just a business, it can be a model for doing the right thing. And let me be very clear, if you are not on board with that vision, you are free to step off now. No one moved. No one dared. Because they all understood something now, something deeper than profits and policies. Change wasn't coming. Change was already here. Addison Riley had never felt smaller. It wasn't the kind of smallness that came from being physically diminished, but the kind that pressed in from the inside, the weight of realization, of regret, of seeing yourself clearly for the first time and not entirely liking what you saw. She had spent 17 years believing she was good at her job, believing she was fair, believing that if people just followed the rules, everything would run smoothly. But now, sitting in a conference room surrounded by diversity consultants, community leaders, and employees of every rank at Skyward Airlines, she was beginning to understand that the rules weren't the problem. The problem was who got punished for breaking them and who didn't. A man at the front of the room, a professor from a university specializing in racial bias studies, clicked to the next slide in his presentation. On the screen was a collection of photos, security camera stills, passenger-submitted footage, even a few from Skyward's own archives. In each image, flight attendants were interacting with passengers. Some were being helped, some were being scolded, some were being removed from flights. Addison recognized herself in one of the stills, her expression unreadable as she stood with her arms crossed near a gate podium, watching as a black couple was told their seats had been reassigned due to an overbooking error. What you're looking at, the professor said, is a pattern, one that repeats itself in airports across the country, across industries, across institutions. We are conditioned to see certain behaviors as threatening when they come from some people, and harmless when they come from others. It is not always conscious, but it is always real. The room was silent. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, Addison forced herself to raise her hand. I never thought of myself as biased, she admitted. I thought I was just doing my job. The professor nodded. That's the most common response. People think racism only looks like explicit hate. They don't recognize it in the small things, the extra scrutiny, the assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, the different standards of patience and grace. Addison's stomach twisted. She thought of the little boy on her flight, the white child who had been bouncing on his seat, his siblings running up and down the aisle. She had smiled at them. She had used her kindest voice. Flying is so exciting, isn't it? And then she thought of Maya and Mila, their matching pink dresses, their quiet obedience, the way she had looked at them and decided without thinking, without even realizing she was doing it, that they were a problem. A woman seated across from her, an older black flight attendant who had been with Skyward even longer than Addison, finally spoke. I've seen this happen for years, she said, her voice steady but tired. I've seen how some passengers get the benefit of the doubt and others get warnings. I've seen how some complaints are taken seriously and others are dismissed. And I've seen how when people like me try to point it out, we get labeled as difficult. Addison looked down at her hands. She had worked with this woman before. She had probably ignored her before. Marcus Robinson was seated near the back of the room, arms crossed, listening. He hadn't spoken much, but he didn't need to. His daughters had already spoken for him. This is the work, the professor continued, his voice breaking the silence again. The hard part isn't identifying the problem. The hard part is deciding to change. Not just in theory, but in practice. So let me ask you all something, what are you willing to do differently? The room shifted. People looked at each other. At their hands. At their feet. At themselves. Addison cleared her throat. I want to learn, she said. And not just from training videos or HR meetings. I want to sit down with passengers who have had these experiences. I want to hear what it felt like. I want to understand. The professor nodded. Good. But learning isn't enough. What else? Addison exhaled. I want to be part of designing a system where this doesn't happen again. Where decisions like mine don't get to be unchecked. Where passengers who feel discriminated against have real ways to challenge it. And where flight crews are held accountable. Marcus Robinson spoke for the first time. That, he said, is a start. But it wasn't just a start. It was a shift. Over the next several weeks, Addison found herself in places she had never been before, community forums where former passengers shared stories of mistreatment at airports. Workshops where racial bias in the service industry was dissected and laid bare. Internal Skyward meetings where executives were forced to face the ugly realities of their own policies. She sat with other flight attendants. Some defensive, some afraid, some quietly relieved that the issue was finally being addressed. She answered hard questions from reporters. She sat across from Maya and Mila Robinson in a quiet meeting room and listened as they told her, in their own words, how it had felt to be judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. You looked at us, Mila had said, but you didn't really see us. It was the most painful thing Addison had ever heard. Because it was true. But pain, she was learning, was not the enemy. Avoidance was. Defensiveness was. The refusal to change was. Skyward Airlines didn't just introduce new policies, it rewrote the book. Hiring practices changed. Training programs expanded. Bias assessments were embedded into decision-making at every level. Complaints that once would have been dismissed were now investigated with real consequences. Passenger advocacy teams were created. And perhaps most importantly, the industry took notice. Other airlines, watching the firestorm that had erupted around Skyward, began implementing their own reviews. Change, once set in motion, was hard to stop. And through it all, Addison kept learning, kept showing up, kept answering hard questions. 3 months after the incident, she was back in uniform, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of boarding flights, she was standing in front of a room of newly hired flight attendants. Leading her first cultural competence training session, she had thought the hardest part would be admitting what she had done wrong. She was wrong. The hardest part was the moment when a young recruit, fresh-faced, eager, raised her hand and asked, "How do we make sure we don't make the same mistake you did?" Addison inhaled. "You pay attention," she said. "You question your instincts. You ask yourself, would I be making this decision if the person in front of me looked different? And if the answer is no, you stop. You rethink. You do better." She scanned the room. "And when you get it wrong, and you will get it wrong, you own it. You listen. You apologize. And then you do better next time." A pause. Then the young woman nodded, scribbling notes in the margin of her training manual. And Addison Riley, for the first time in 17 years, felt like she was finally doing her job the right way. The thing about change is that it doesn't happen in a single moment. It's not the viral video. Not the boardroom confrontation. Not even the grand apology. Change happens in the quiet. In the spaces between the headlines. In the choices people make when no one is watching. And for Maya and Mila Robinson, change wasn't just something happening around them, it was something happening to them. 3 months had passed since they had been removed from Flight 1423. 3 months since their pink dresses became a symbol. Since their names trended on social media. Since their father's voice echoed through corporate hallways demanding something more than damage control. They had been on television, interviewed by reporters, praised as symbols of resilience. But for all the noise, all the attention, all the sweeping reforms and press releases, the truth was simple. They were still just two 11-year-old girls who had been hurt. And healing, like change, was slow. They didn't talk about it much. Not to each other. Not to their father. They had learned, in that unspoken way that siblings do, how to carry their pain in parallel, never forcing the other to look too closely. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when they passed through security at an airport and felt the eyes linger too long. When a flight attendant's smile seemed just a little too careful, they felt it. The weight of what had happened. The knowledge that the world had already decided something about them before they even had the chance to speak. And then, one day, their father said, "It's time." They were going to Atlanta. This time, he was going with them. The airport felt different now. Not just because of the changes Skyward had made, but because they were different. As they approached the gate, a woman in a Navy uniform stepped forward. She was young, black, with a warm smile and a name tag that read Jasmine Williams. "Flight attendant, Mr. Robinson," she greeted, then turned to the twins. "Maya, Mila, I just wanted to say thank you." The girls exchanged a glance. "For what?" Maya asked. Jasmine knelt down slightly, her voice dropping into something more personal. "Because of you. A lot of things are different now. There are more of us working these flights. There are better rules in place. And kids like you, kids who look like you, don't have to worry about what happened to you happening to them." She smiled, soft but sure. "That's because of you." The words landed somewhere deep. Somewhere neither of them had realized was still raw. Because of them. As they boarded, they noticed something else. The passengers, more diverse. The crew, more attentive, but not cautious. Not strained, just present, watching, but in the way that says we see you. Not we're evaluating you. They settled into their seats. Their father beside them, and for the first time in months, Maya let herself exhale. Halfway through the flight, Mila turned to their dad. "Do you think it's really different now?" Marcus studied his daughters. These girls who had been forced to grow up in ways they never should have. He thought about the changes, the policies rewritten, the training programs established, the executives who had been forced to confront things they had long ignored. He thought about Addison Riley, standing in front of new recruits, teaching them how to unlearn the very things she had once enforced. And then he thought about Jasmine Williams, standing at the gate, living proof that opportunity had expanded, that the world had stretched just a little wider. He looked at his daughters, his voice steady. "It's better than it was yesterday. And tomorrow, it will be better than today. That's how change works." Mila considered this, then nodded. "I guess that means we have to keep making it better, too." Marcus smiled. "Yes, it does." The plane hummed forward, cutting through the sky, carrying them toward a future that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it truly belonged to them. 365 days. That's how long it had been since Flight 1423. Since two little girls in pink dresses had been escorted off a plane for no reason other than existing in a space where someone decided they didn't belong. A year since their father walked into a boardroom and shattered the comfortable excuses of an industry that had looked the other way for far too long. A year since the world watched, debated, demanded, and most surprisingly change. Now, Maya and Mila Robinson stood in the middle of Skyward Airlines headquarters. Their pink dresses long since outgrown, replaced by a quiet confidence that had taken its place. The company was hosting an anniversary event, not a celebration, but a reckoning, a moment to reflect, to acknowledge, to prove that what happened that day wasn't just a headline but a turning point. It wasn't about patting themselves on the back. It was about making sure no one forgot why they had to change in the first place. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed the title of the documentary that had taken their story beyond news cycles and social media outrage. Pink Dresses, Blue Skies, a film not just about injustice, but about transformation. It followed the journey of Skyward's reckoning, of Marcus Robinson's relentless pursuit of accountability, of Addison Riley's slow, painful, necessary evolution from enforcer to advocate. It was about the way the industry had been forced to examine itself, to acknowledge the blind spots that had always been there but had never been addressed. And now, for the first time, Maya and Mila were seeing the final cut. On the screen, a clip played from their sit-down conversation with Addison Riley, the woman who had been at the center of their humiliation and, eventually, their healing. The camera captured the moment when Mila, never one to mince words, had asked, "Did you know you were treating us differently?" Addison's face on the screen was raw, unguarded. "No," she admitted, "and that was the problem. I thought I was being fair. I thought I was following the rules. But when I watched the video of what I did, and then watched how I treated other passengers that same day, I couldn't deny it. I saw the difference. I saw me." In the audience, Addison sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching herself from a year ago. The woman on the screen looked rigid, unsure, still carrying the weight of who she had been. The woman sitting here today looked different, not softened. but reshaped, humbled, accountable. The documentary continued, showing interviews with airline executives who had resisted change at first but could no longer ignore the numbers. The data had been damning passengers of color disproportionately flagged for disruptive behavior. Complaints from black travelers dismissed at nearly double the rate of their white counterparts. Flight crews that remained overwhelmingly white despite serving one of the most diverse industries in the world. Then came the footage of what had been done about it. Skyward Airlines had rewritten its policies. Not just with words but with action. Bias training was now required not as a one-time seminar but as an ongoing process woven into hiring, training, and promotion structures. A new passenger advocacy program ensured that customers who felt mistreated had real channels to be heard and that complaints weren't just filed away, but investigated and acted upon. Flight crews were being diversified at every level. And most importantly, transparency had replaced the corporate instinct to sweep uncomfortable truths under the rug. As the final scenes played, showing Maya and Mila boarding a skyward flight a year later, this time with their father. This time with an airline that had worked to earn their trust, the words that appeared on screen were simple, but powerful. Change is not a moment. It is a movement, and it only continues if we do. The lights came up, and for a moment, the room was silent, not out of discomfort, but out of something deeper, recognition. Then, applause. Not polite, not performative, but real. Maya and Mila sat still, taking it all in. When they looked at their father, he was already watching them. Waiting. So, he asked quietly, was it worth telling the story? The twins exchanged a glance. That wordless communication they had perfected since birth. Maya spoke first. I think it's important that people see it. Mila nodded. Not just what happened to us. What happened after. Their father smiled. That's the part that matters most. Across the room, Addison Riley was approached by a young flight attendant, barely out of training. I just wanted to say. The woman said hesitantly, I took your training course. The way you explained bias, it made me think about things I never noticed before. Addison nodded, something settling in her chest. She had spent months wondering if her presence in this fight was even welcome. If her redemption was something she had the right to claim. But the truth was, it was never about redemption. It was about responsibility. Keep noticing, she told the young woman. That's the only way things change. As the event wrapped up, as business leaders, flight crews, and passengers mingled and exchanged stories, as journalists prepared their headlines and cameras shut down, Marcus Robinson stood near the exit, watching his daughters. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one had been different. This one had been personal. And yet, standing here now, seeing what had come from it, he realized something. This wasn't just about his daughters anymore. It was about the next Maya, the next Mila, the next child who deserved to step onto a plane and be seen not as a problem, but as a person. And that, he knew, was worth every fight still to come. 20 years had passed since that day at the airport, but the memory of it never fully faded. It had been talked about in boardrooms, studied in business schools, dissected in articles about corporate responsibility and racial bias. It had become a case study, a cautionary tale, a rallying cry. But for Maya and Mila Robinson, it had never been about the headlines or the policies. It had been about a single moment in their childhood that forced the world to take a long, hard look at itself. And now, 2 decades later, they stood at the center of a gathering that might never have happened if not for that day. The event was held in a grand hall, the kind of place where history was honored, where achievements were recognized. But tonight was not about celebrating the past. It was about charting the future. Skyward Airlines was marking 20 years of transformation, and the company had invited not just executives and politicians but employees, passengers, activists, anyone who had played a role in the journey from scandal to industry leader. Maya adjusted the microphone at the podium, her presence commanding, her words measured. 20 years ago, she began, my sister and I boarded a plane in pink dresses. We didn't know then that those dresses would become symbols of both discrimination and transformation. We didn't know that what happened to us would become bigger than us. She glanced at Mila, who stepped forward, her voice steady. We were 11. We were just 2 kids following the rules. But rules don't always work the same way for everyone. And that's why we're here tonight, not just to talk about what was wrong, but to remind ourselves that fixing it was only the first step. The room was silent in the way that meant people were listening. Marcus Robinson, their father, watched from the front row. His daughters, now women, standing in their own power. He had always known they would do something meaningful with their lives. He just hadn't known that meaning would be born from something so painful. Behind them, the massive screen showed images of the past 20 years' new training programs. New hiring practices, new faces in leadership roles. But the most powerful image was the simplest one. A young black girl boarding a plane. Holding her mother's hand, her pink dress fluttering as she walked down the jet bridge. No hesitation, no second glances, just a girl on a journey. Exactly as it should be. Among the attendees was Addison Riley. She had aged gracefully. But more than that, she had evolved. She had spent the past 2 decades working not just to undo what she had done, but to change the system that had allowed it to happen. Her name, once attached to controversy, had become synonymous with change. And as she listened to the twins speak, she realized something she had spent years wondering if she would ever be forgiven. But that had never been the point. The point was the work. The work had always been the point. Caroline Weber, now retired, leaned over to Benjamin Hayes, the former captain of Flight 1423, who had delayed his retirement to fly in for the event. "Did you ever think we'd see this day?" she asked. Hayes smiled. "If you'd told me 20 years ago that an entire industry would change because of 2 little girls in pink dresses, I would have said you were dreaming. But maybe that's the problem. We don't dream big enough." The night moved forward with conversations, with connections, with the quiet acknowledgement that change isn't something that happens once and is finished. It is something that requires constant tending, constant effort, constant willingness to ask, "Are we doing enough?" As the event wound down, Marcus Robinson found himself standing outside with his daughters, looking up at the night sky. "Your mother would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maya and Mila didn't respond right away. Instead, they looked at each other, sharing that silent understanding that only siblings have. Then Mila spoke. "She is proud." A beat of silence. Then Marcus nodded. A few feet away, a journalist approached them. "Before you go," she said, "one last question. After all these years, do you think the world is better now?" Maya smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held both hope and wisdom. "It's better than it was. But that doesn't mean the work is done." Mila added, "That just means it's our turn to keep going." And with that, they stepped away from the cameras, away from the stage, away from the history they had made toward whatever came next. Because change doesn't rest, and neither would they.